Okay, my name's Machon, and I used to work for MI5 as an intelligence officer back in the 90s, a long time ago now. And after that, I left with my ex-partner and ex-colleague, David Shaler, to blow the whistle on the crimes of the spies. But today I want to talk mainly, I will just run through some of the headlines from that. What I want to do is talk mainly about what it feels like to live in a police state, what we mean by this, and how far down the road are we in the UK and other Western countries, and what can we do about it, crucially, as well. So it's really coming from the perspective of someone who was part of that police state, trying to sort of give some headlines about where we are now and what we can do. As I mentioned, I used to work for MI5. I was recruited in the early 1990s, along with David Shaler, to be part of what was called a new breed of intelligence officer to work on counter-terrorism cases. But we saw so many things going wrong, that we felt compelled to resign and then to blow the whistle on the crimes of the spies. And we did that in order to try and get a lot of publicity on the issues and to force an inquiry. But the government, the new Labour government as it was then, managed to slide its way around and spin its way out of any sort of inquiry, as it so often does. But just to recap, we joined in 1991 and we left in 1996. And we had 3 different postings each. First of all, in the political counter-subversion section, then the counter-terrorism section with the Irish, and then with the counter-terrorism section internationally. So it wasn't actually a very long time we were there. And I suppose the 1990s were arguably the most ethical time that you could have worked for MI5, because they, at that point, had just been made legal, and at that point, they hadn't got involved in torture. So it was a little narrow window of opportunity. And yet, despite that, David and I saw so many things wrong, even in those 3 short postings, that we felt compelled to do something about it. So God knows what else is going on in the background. We saw in the political section things like files on all sorts of activists, left-wing groups, political subversives, as they were called. And you might say, well, okay, if you've got an organisation like the old Communist Party that is trying to subvert the state from within and is being funded by the Soviet Union, then there might be an argument for investigating people involved in that group because they might threaten the integrity of this country. Might be, I say. But MI5 got so paranoid, they just spread out this investigation as a sort of big net to investigate anyone they didn't like. So it was all the extreme left-wing groups, the extreme right-wing groups, and anyone they deemed to be a bit of a troublemaker. So we saw hideous files on people who were working with CND or with the Green and Common Women, if some of you are old enough to remember them back in the 80s, Liberty, the Civil Liberties Union, and they could be recorded and have a file opened on them, and they could be investigated aggressively purely because they might be query sympathiser of communism or Trotskyism or whatever. And this was a huge reach they had. They had files on about 1 million people, citizens of this country, purely for their democratic political right, just to be active politically, think about stuff, get involved. So I think it's probably safe to say now, as more people do get more involved in action groups and activism groups and single-issue campaigns, that the force is now back there. They are watching more and more activist groups. We also saw at that time that they had files on politicians. Anyone who stands as an MP is checked against their database. If there's a file on them, that file is brought up and it's assessed, and then a threat assessment's written. So most of the people who've been through the Labour government over the last 13 years had an MI5 file held on them. So every time you see, or every time you ever see, any government shoveling more money and resources and powers and everything to the spies, quite a lot of the time it's because of fear. They don't want to say no to them because they don't know what's on their file. They don't know what guilty little secrets MI5 has found out about. So they tend to do the spies' bidding rather than the other way around, which I think is a real problem for our democracy. But we also saw things going wrong in the Irish section, where bombs planted by the IRA on the UK mainland could and should have been prevented. And we saw also in G branch, which was the international terrorism section, examples of false flag terrorism, where attacks were carried out and then blamed on other, they were blamed on one group, but actually carried out by a different group. So we saw a whole range of different things going wrong. And you sort of think, well, what can you do? We both joined up quite idealistically in our early 20s, and we wanted to make a difference. We wanted to try and do something that was important and could save lives and all the rest of it. But also, I mean, you know, you get approached by MI5, and it's all very secret. And you think, God, it'd be really fun to find out what they're up to, what they really get up to. So we both were recruited, and we didn't like what we saw, so we went public. We went on the run, went to the newspapers, because in the UK we have this law called the Official Secrets Act, which basically makes it a crime for an intelligence officer or a former intelligence officer to say anything ever about their work. You can't even go to your MP or to the police with evidence of crime that you've witnessed within the organisations, because you are the one who will be put in prison. You are the one who will be penalised as a criminal. So we knew that might happen, but we decided to go to the papers and make as big a splash as possible in order to get the media behind us so that they would push for an inquiry into the spy crimes. And for that, David, Shayla and I ended up, way back in the 90s, literally having to go on the run around Europe for a month. We just fled the country just as the story broke, and MI5 was hot on our trail, and we were just moving around, being very careful, using some of the sort of anti-surveillance tactics we learned inside MI5 to evade them. And we ended up in France, actually. We hid there for 3 years, fighting and fighting for an inquiry into the spy crimes. And the government just kept refusing to do it. It was weird as well. It was the honeymoon period of the new Labour government at that point. And you think they would be hot on spies being out of control, spies investigating left-wing activists and things like that, but they weren't. They just covered up for them. In fact, one of the interesting things is, as I said, most of the members of the Labour government had files held on them by MI5. And at that time, MI5's political master was a guy called Jack Straw, all our favourite politician, eh? Mr. Egalitarian, Mr. I'm going to stand up and be moral and ethical and all the rest of it. He had a file. So he's supposed to be the boss of MI5, but they had a file on him, and they had categorised him as a threat to national security because of his involvement with left-wing activism. Now, okay, you're Jack Straw, you're sitting behind your big desk in Whitehall, and you hear about this. What do? Do you say, actually, yeah, they got it right, I was a threat to national security, so I should resign? Or they got it wrong, therefore how many other people might have they got it wrong about? So perhaps we should have a look at what the spies have been getting up to. And he didn't. He just said, I trust them, and that's it. He covered up for them. Anyway, throughout the story, we were on the run. We lived in exile. David came back in 2000 voluntarily to face trial in the UK under the Official Secrets Act and went through a sort of kangaroo court and a vilification in the press, whereby the judge in the court case at the end of the case made his formal ruling and said stuff like, well, you know, I accept that he did what he did in the public interest. He did what he did, and there was no financial motivation behind it. And he did what he did, and no agent lives were put at risk. And yet the press the next day reported precisely the opposite. Shayla sells agent lives down the river for money. I was like, where did that come from? So I'm sitting in a courtroom watching the journalists write all this down, and they just completely change it. It was interesting watching how the media could be so spun like that, somehow. And the other side of this story as well was what it was like after you've been a sort of gamekeeper turned poacher, having been the person watching people, investigating them, running agents, listening to telephone taps. Suddenly you're the whistleblower, and suddenly you are the target. And it was very strange. I mean, I haven't felt secure in being able to talk entirely freely over my home phone or any phone for the last 13 years. I've just got used to the idea that potentially there could be a bug in my flat, potentially there could be a tap on my phone line, potentially some of my friends might have been turned and they're reporting on me as agents, because that all happened during the whistleblowing years. That lack of privacy, that sense of pervasive being watched and not having ultimate privacy and freedom was actually really difficult to live with. And it certainly went on for the first few years, we know that. And even last year, I had a mobile phone that had this funny little quirk whereby people would ring me on the phone and it would have this sort of strangulated ringtone. It didn't sound right to them when they were calling in. And then they would hear what was going on around the phone. It was like a recording device. They heard my conversations and what I was saying and things. So this went on for a couple of weeks and they were telling me, this is a bit weird. So I tried it. I rang in from a different number and I could hear exactly. This mobile phone of mine was a recording device, which is a bit embarrassing actually sometimes, you know, when numbers come through and you say, oh, I don't want to talk to so-and-so right now because... So that was strange. But then I thought, well, okay, I'm a bit hacked off with this. I'm going to say something. I rang up someone on my landline and said, look, this is really stupid. My mobile phone's playing up. It's doing this, that, and the other. Do you think? And lo and behold, 24 hours later, my mobile phone started working okay. So it's like whatever was happening had been stopped. I don't know. I don't know if it was a bug or whatever, but it was a very strange thing, and that was only last year. So my sense of privacy, I think, has gone from the whistleblowing years. And this is what leads me on, really, today, to the main theme of the talk. Are we there yet? And what I mean by that is, are we there yet in terms of living under a police state? And I really want to get you, I know it's a festival, I really want to get you to focus on the down bit first, but then there is an up bit at the end, I promise you. The down bit is, what is it really like to live in a police state? What do we mean by this? Really? I mean, most of us are pissed off, I think, with some of the measures that have come in the last 10 years. You know, all the surveillance, the lack of right to protest, the Section 44 of the Terrorism Act, which means police can stop us and arrest us for no reason. The endemic CCTV, RIPA, the Regulation of Investigatory Powers Act, which is the interception of phone lines, which even local councils can now use. You know, there are about 800 public bodies in the UK can use this law, and most people aren't even aware of it, and they do use this law. What is it really like? What do we mean? So we throw around all sorts of phrases, you know, you're fascist, it's authoritarian, it's totalitarian, you're a Nazi, whatever. And we get angry when we see the police at demonstrations, we get angry at the fact we have to ask permission to protest, things like that. I think we need to take a little step back, a little sort of walk down history lane as to what we actually mean by this. What is the fundamental? And I think there are two fundamentals. In terms of government, all governments want power. They all want control. The more power they have, the happier they are. And it's a constant battle between us, the citizens, and then the government, pushing against each other. And in non-ideological societies, it's called authoritarianism. If you get an ideological society, something that's governed by, say, the communists or capitalist systems or whatever, then perhaps we can call it totalitarianism, because it's the whole thing. It's not just about the control of us, the society, it's about the means of control, how we do it. Is it through the political system? Is it just through having a secret police like the Stasi or MI5, which is what they've pretty much become? Or is it something slightly more broad? And I think it is. It's turning that way now. And I think many of us are aware of these issues, where you have the corruption of the political system, where it's not representative, where you have a judiciary that cannot be trusted to uphold basic law, where you have a media that can be spun and controlled, where you have an economic system that they just do what they want, no matter what the democratic will is. And also then when you have the control of the populace. So I'd say totalitarianism is a sort of 360-degree control of society, not just what we do, but also what we think, what we ingest as information, how we can do something about it. And that's what they're doing. And